Hi, everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces and names and to see some new folks that maybe I haven't met before. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully I get a thumbs up from some people on staff that you're seeing my screen. Great. Wonderful. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go at a lightning speed to kind of walk you through our analysis and summary of the governor's fiscal year 2026 state budget. So, about 2.5 weeks ago, Governor Lee delivered his State of the State address for 2025, and he introduced his recommended budget for fiscal year 2026. So I'm here to walk you through that request, talk you through, how much is in it, where the money's coming from, where it's going. Going to cover some budget basics at the beginning just to make sure we're all on the same page with our understanding of things. So these are some basic concepts that we cover in our budget primer, which you can access on our website or order a hard copy on our website for a great deal, a textbook for a great deal. So also, if I don't see your question in the chat, hopefully there will be time at the end to do some question and answers. And if not, we're human beings here in an office, and you are more than welcome to give us a call or email me if I didn't cover your question on the call. So please feel free to reach out to us. I am more than happy to answer your question. So first, just a few budget basics. The first thing to know, of course, is that we are a balanced budget state. We have a balanced budget requirement in our state constitution, and it says that expenditures for any fiscal year shall not exceed the state's revenues and reserves for that year. So in other words, the state cannot spend more money in a given year than it brings in or has on hand that year. So that means that the state budget is full of trade-offs. We have to keep revenues in balance with expenditures. Every dollar spent on one thing is a dollar that can't be spent on something else or can't be given back to the taxpayer. So there are constant trade-offs. Another important concept is the difference between recurring and non-recurring. Recurring items are expected to happen again and again, and non-recurring are one time. So both expenditures and revenues are categorized in this way. Distinguishing between these two things sort of helps keep the budget balanced over the longer term. So if you have some new expense that you're going to fund every year, that's recurring. And you want to keep that budget balanced over the long term. So you want to pay for it with either some new recurring revenue source or cut spending on something that was recurring. Most of the budget is recurring. Non-recurring expenses are often things like road projects or buildings, pilot programs, and non-recurring revenues are usually like surplus dollars, money that's left over at the end of a fiscal year that you only get one time. Another important concept is the recurring base budget. It's all the stuff that is in the general fund that's expected to happen year after year. This is the starting point for each year's budget. So when the executive branch begins planning for the next year's budget, they begin with all those recurring items, and then they add or they take away from them. So the things that really get the most scrutiny tend to be the recurring increases. So these include inflationary increases. So, the things that the formula for the school funding dictate, inflationary cost increases in TennCare, inflationary cost increases in the Department of Correction based on how many, prisoners we think we're going to have and the cost it will take to house those prisoners. Nothing in the budget grows automatically per se. Those recurring increases have to be calculated. They have to be requested and recommended in the budget, and they have to be approved by the General Assembly. And they do undergo scrutiny in the budget process. Other things that undergo scrutiny are new recurring expansions or initiatives on top of those inflationary increases. So this means that only a small portion of the budget really has much flexibility in terms of scaling up and down after you have to fund all those inflationary increases. And then the other things that get a lot of scrutiny are those non-recurring items. Again, one-time things that by their nature are one-time or pilot programs or things like that. Another important part of the budget process, of course, is revenue estimation. So when you are operating in a balanced budget environment, all the decisions about spending are done within the limits of some estimate of how much revenue you think that you are going to have in this future year. The last basic thing to know is that along with the recommendation for fiscal year 2026, the budget also includes changes to fiscal year 2025. So fiscal year 2026 is next fiscal year that will begin this summer, and fiscal year 2025 is this fiscal year that we're in right now. And those changes to the current fiscal year typically include some mid-year adjustment of the revenue estimate. So how much tax revenue we think we're going to get based on the experience that we have so far in the middle of the fiscal year. And then usually some supplemental spending. So changes to the costs that we have. Maybe we're underspending in some areas. Maybe we have new needs that we didn't know we were going to have, when the budget was put together last year. Okay, so what is in the budget? First, some top line numbers. From all sources, we are looking at a $59.5 billion budget in fiscal year 2026. That is $1.1 billion lower than the estimate for the current year, or about 2% less. Looking at just the state dollars, which is about half, that is $29.5 billion in 2026. That's about $2.4 billion more than the estimate for the current fiscal year, or about 9% higher. Now moving forward, just so we don't get lost in the numbers, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a key takeaway, and then I'm going to walk you through the numbers that back up that key takeaway. So the first takeaway is, I think there's still a lot of talk that we're entering kind of a more austere era. But there is still a lot of new spending in the budget compared to the 2025 enacted budget, sort of where we ended up at the end of the last legislative session. In fact, there's about $4.5 billion more in recurring increases and new non-recurring allocations over both fiscal year 2025 and 2026. And here's how those break down. The budget includes about $1.4 billion in new recurring increases and $3.2 billion in non-recurring items. Those include $1 billion in new spending recommendations for fiscal year 2026, $172 million in new spending in 2026 that was approved in the special session in January, about $171 million in other recurring things. On the non-recurring side, we have about $2.4 billion in non-recurring new spending items in 2026. All the new non-recurring items that were approved in the special session, and then about $80 million in non-recurring items kind of in this other category. So where does all this money come from? That money largely comes from unallocated recurring dollars, last year's surplus, and some new tax revenue growth. So here's how that breaks down. And it's about $1.8 billion in recurring items and $2.7 billion in non-recurring. And as we move through these items, I'm going to highlight where we might expect some of these things to go away in the future, just so you might know what to expect in the future as we move forward. So first, the 2026 budget draws on about $974 million in recurring revenue that the prior budget allocated for non-recurring purposes. So in other words, the last several budgets used new recurring revenues, so revenues that we thought we were going to get year after year after year, instead of using them on new things that were going to happen year after year after year. Policymakers decided to use those on one-time purposes for fear that maybe those revenue collections would not materialize year after year. Instead, they were fearful that they might slow or decline. So by not tying those dollars up for long-term commitments, they remain unallocated in that base budget. So they were not, they were available to use for new recurring items. The second big bucket on the recurring side was new revenue growth. About $377 million they expect to get in new revenue growth in 2026. And then about $335 million from some other sources and a few spending cuts in 2026. On the non-recurring side, and really the single largest source of dollars in this budget, is a $1.6 billion surplus that was available at the end of 2024. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. A $496 million was available in 2025 from the treasurer's investment of reserves that the state has, so interest off the reserves. This is something that we might expect to go away in the future. These are dollars we've actually been earning for a few years now in unbudgeted, non-recurring revenues. And we've had a lot of cash on hand that we've been earning interest on as a state. And that's largely been coming from COVID dollars that states got. We got a lot of COVID dollars at one time. States had a lot of years to spend them. So we've just been sitting on this cash, and we've been able to invest those dollars, earn interest off those dollars, but those dollars are going to go away as we're spending them. So we really won't be able to kind of earn that interest moving forward. And those have been like a nice chunk of money that states have been able to earn revenue off of and spend those dollars. I think there was a really great article from Pew recently about how states are really not going to be able to rely on that source of revenue moving forward. So we would expect that kind of nice little chunk of money to be going away soon. Another source of revenue has been last year, the state set aside $150 million in case we didn't meet revenue projections in 2024. In the end, the state didn't end up needing that. So we have those dollars we can spend. At the end of last year, the state set aside a big chunk of money for some tax refunds in our corporate taxes. There's about 113 million of that the state thinks it won't need to refund. So those are revenues we can use. And then there's about 393 million in other sources and a small chunk in some non-recurring spending cuts. So one piece of that is the state had another big surplus at the end of 2024. So kind of back to that chart, we're talking about this big piece right here, this $1.6 billion. So putting that in context, you see this is another historically large budget surplus. Not quite as big as the ones we had a couple of years ago, but still pretty big in a historical context. So where is that money coming from? It is coming from what is called agency reversion. So when agencies send unspent money back to the general fund at the end of the fiscal year, so they are reverting dollars to the general fund, those are called reversions. So, breaking this down by agency, these are where those reversions came from. So the largest chunk in 2024 came from TennCare. You see that's the first bar chart there. Those largely came from an enhanced federal match rate for TennCare that was tied to the pandemic's public health emergency. So, typically it's about a 2/3, 1/3 split between the state and federal government. We got a higher match rate during the pandemic's public health emergency. We didn't necessarily budget differently for that during that. And so, at the end of those fiscal years, the TennCare program was sending state dollars back to the general fund because they were getting more federal dollars than was budgeted. So that actually ended in fiscal year 2024. So that's over. And so these very large reversions from TennCare are probably going to go away. So we may not have these very large surpluses that are due to agency reversions anymore. So it's possible that this large funding source moving forward may not be there anymore. Not sure. I continue to be surprised by the large surpluses. So TBD, but that is just something to keep in mind. Next takeaway, the new expected tax revenue growth is more typical of the years before the ups and downs we've been seeing in our tax collections over the last 5 years. So back to kind of where our money came from chart. Now we're focusing on this little square here, the 377 million that the budget assumes we'll get in new tax growth in 2026. So this is what that growth looks like from 2025 to 2026. That's a growth rate of about 3.4%. 1% in overall taxes. So kind of zooming out a little bit from that. So in the current year, they're actually expecting a dip because of some tax cuts that were made in the franchise and excise taxes. So zooming out a little bit more, and what you see is some super rapid growth during the pandemic years. Now zooming out even more, and you see that the growth that we're expecting from 2025 to 2026 is a lot more typical of those growth rates that we were seeing kind of before we went into those pandemic years. So it's really important to kind of put those in context and zoom a little bit further out, that those growth amounts that we were getting in 2020, 2021, 2022 were very atypical. Like, you typically are not getting 20% growth rates. So this is how our state tax revenues break down. So I want to drill a little bit more into what was going on in those years. So the vast majority of our state taxes come from our sales tax. And then the next biggest is our franchise and excise taxes, which are our corporate taxes. As I'm sure you all know, we don't have an individual income tax in Tennessee. So we really rely on these two taxes more than any other taxes. And so here's what's been going on with those two taxes over that period that I just showed you. So here's our sales tax. And what you see here is a lot of growth, really, with the exception of just between 2023 and 2024, it was a little flat that year, but otherwise like kind of steady growth over this period, and that really rapid growth during the pandemic. Now here's our franchise and excise taxes. Good growth up until about 2023. And then we had 2 years in which the General Assembly enacted some tax cuts. So that's what you're seeing, the impact of those in those years where the line is going down. So that's what's going on here, is we had rapid growth, and then we were absorbing tax cuts that the General Assembly enacted in a couple of years. And now what's happening is we're kind of stabilizing after all those things, happened and then went into effect. So here's the expected growth rate for all those state taxes, and then each tax type for the budget. So again, the strongest is really happening in our general sales tax. Then the rest of them are pretty sluggish, really unlikely to even make up for inflation. So while we're on the topic of taxes, something that you don't see in the budget that you have seen in recent budgets is, unlike in recent past years, the budget has no new significant tax cuts, and it has no changes to the current year's tax estimate. So like I said earlier, usually what you see in the budget is a re-estimate of the current year's tax projection, but tax collections are actually coming in pretty close to projections. So they chose not to change the current year's projection. And there aren't really any proposals for significant new tax cuts. So this really is kind of a stabilization year. We're absorbing everything that's going on, and we're keeping things pretty steady. So no visualizations to show you in this key takeaway section. Okay, so let's move on to spending. First thing to know is the budget reflects spending from January's special session. So back to, this is the where the money goes chart again. So we're really focusing on these boxes right here. A lot of the 2025 non-recurring was related to disaster recovery. So that's the stuff on the right-hand side of the screen. And then the rest was related to education. So on the education side, we had the Education Freedom Scholarships Act. In that, about 146 million recurring was dedicated for up to 20,000 scholarships beginning in fiscal year 2026. These scholarships fund students to go to private schools. Those scholarships under the Education Freedom Scholarships Act will grow by 5,000 scholarships each year. That is subject to both interest in the scholarships in the prior year. So at least the applications have to be equal to at least 75% of slots in the prior year for it to grow by 5,000 in the next year. And policymakers have to provide enough funding to actually fund 5,000 more scholarships. It's not like an entitlement program at the federal level. That's just not really how state budgets work. The money has to be made available in order for the scholarships to be made available. The amount of the scholarships that will be made available to students is tied to the amount of the base formula amount for public school students, the school funding formula, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the priority, so in the first year, there's 20,000 scholarships. Half of those scholarships, 10,000, priority is given to students who are in families with incomes that are at 3 times the reduced price lunch level. As an example, that equals about $173,000 a year for a family of 4 in 2024. For reference, the median family income for a family of 4 in Tennessee in 2023 was about $107,000. So half of families of 4 in Tennessee had incomes below 107,000, half had incomes above. So this priority level would reach well over half of families in Tennessee, more than likely in that first year. There is a hold harmless provision for enrollment declines of any kind, meaning if a school district were to experience an enrollment decline, they wouldn't necessarily face reduced school funding from the state. But it's a very nuanced hold harmless provision. So it is only triggered if a district experiences both an enrollment loss and a decline in its total TISA calculation. So TISA is the school funding formula. It's a complicated formula. It's simpler than the old funding formula, but it is still a complicated formula that has a lot of moving pieces to it. The base amount in that formula typically grows each year, which I'll talk about in a second. It typically grows by about 3% each year. So a district would have to experience an enrollment loss that more than offsets that base funding increase in order to qualify for the hold harmless provision. The enrollment loss does not have to be associated with the Education Freedom Scholarships in any way. It could be an enrollment loss of any kind, but it would have to meet both of these criteria in order to qualify for the hold harmless provision. But the hold harmless is in place forevermore. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily be in the first year after the scholarships are in place. The way it is written right now is it is a permanent hold harmless provision. But that is part of the Education Freedom Scholarship Act. I will plug that we have a paper that is available on our website, a resource on our website that kind of outlines the basic provisions of the Education Freedom Scholarship Act, and it also provides some resources on private schools in Tennessee, including a breakdown of kind of the different types of private schools in Tennessee, which ones qualify under the Education Freedom Scholarship Act, and a dashboard that shows you where private schools in Tennessee are located, just to kind of give you some context on like, where are these schools available? Where might students be drawn to these schools, for example? So that's something that you might want to check out if you're interested in that topic. Other spending in the special session included $198 million in non-recurring dollars for a one-time $2,000 bonus for public school teachers in 2026. There was about $23 million in recurring dollars for grants to certain school districts. Beginning in 2025, those are school districts that have a lot of schools that have received a grade A. And for the Sevier County School District, about $77 million in recurring dollars that will divert sports betting taxes from the Lottery for Education account, which funds lottery funded scholarships, for a new school construction and maintenance account, which I will actually talk a little bit more about in a second. And then about $470 million in non-recurring dollars for disaster recovery efforts. Okay, so moving on to the new recommendations for 2026. So back to our chart for context, we're focusing on these big chunks now, both on the recurring side on the left and and on the non-recurring on the right. So kind of breaking those down across the spending categories. To highlight the biggest things on each side, again, we have the recurring on the left-hand side and the non-recurring on the right-hand side. The biggest is $281 million for 10-care related cost increases. These include things like just inflationary cost increases. There are routine changes in the federal match rate, and even just tiny changes in that, a 100th percentage point change in that match rate just changes the cost a lot because it's a very expensive program. Changes in enrollment numbers, those just ripple through, and it has a large impact on the budget. The next largest is $207 million for several different things across K through 12 education, all in the public K through 12 education space. So this excludes the Education Freedom Scholarships, Education Savings Accounts. This is just public K through 12 education. And then $191 million for state employee raises and health insurance increases. So this is kind of when I say that inflationary cost increases take up a lot of the recurring cost increases, this is what I mean. And then there's very little room left for new initiatives and things like that. That's what I mean. On the non-recurring side, kind of the biggest things are a $1 billion general fund subsidy for the highway fund, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Then there's about $221 million spread across several categories for public safety activities, crime prevention activities, and about $206 million spread across several categories for both the dedicated capital outlay program and then some other capital activities and maintenance activities that are sort of within agencies that don't meet the criteria for the capital outlay program. So now I'm going to kind of just focus on some things that we highlighted in our report. The first is that the budget includes some typical increases for the school funding formula. So the budget includes a total of $7 billion for the TISA school funding formula. Within that is an $88 million increase recurring for teacher pay. The total there is $125 million when you combine it with the required local contribution. Just for context, the special sessions $2,000 bonuses cost $198 million. So I kind of just, once the special session put a price tag on what it costs to give every teacher $2,000, I just thought it was interesting to kind of put that price alongside the cost of the required increases in teacher pay that are included in the TISA school funding formula. Every year we do a little update on the data that's available on teacher pay. And despite these annual dedicated recurring increases for teacher pay in Tennessee just has not kept up with inflation. So what we're looking at here is average public school teacher salaries adjusted for inflation using the CPIU. That's the bars. The dotted line is just the unadjusted number. So between the school year ending in 2010 and the one ending in 2023, the average teacher pay has actually declined by 20% during that time. So despite all of these investments, teacher pay is just not keeping up with inflation in Tennessee. Other things within that total for the TISA school funding formula include $77 million to provide a 3.1% inflationary increase in the base amount for that formula. So that is growing the base amount. This school year, it's $7,075 per student. And next year, under the proposal, it'd be $7,295. Also within that total would be assumptions around enrollment growth, and there's some increases in there for career and technical education. I highlight this because the previous funding formula, it had automatic inflationary adjustments built into the statute. So those happened automatically. Under the current school funding formula, it is incumbent upon policymakers to propose those and approve those in the budget process. And that is happening. It has happened every year, since TISA has been in place. And that is included in the current budget. There's also $25 million split between recurring and non-recurring for a fast growth fund, which provides extra dollars to school districts that are experiencing, rapid growth in their enrollment numbers. There's also $80 million that is still in the 2025 base that the administration had calculated would go out through the TISA school funding formula based on assumptions about enrollment that actually did not end up going out because enrollment wasn't as high as they expected it to be, that they expect will go out in 2026. So, they're saying that actually the increase for TISA is higher than it looks like it is on paper, and that those dollars will go out to districts. And so districts should expect the increase to actually be more than it looks like it will be if you just did the math based on the numbers on paper. So, so that might actually be a higher increase than they're expecting it to be. So all in all, this is kind of what annual funding for BEP slash TISA, the school funding formula, over time has looked like, both unadjusted, that's kind of the bubble line, and adjusted for inflation, that's the dotted line, over time has looked like. So you see that, even adjusting for inflation, we have seen real growth over time in that funding formula. The bar chart that is kind of behind it shows you the annual unadjusted change in the funding. And you see that the 2026 recommendation there is in line with kind of previous annual increases in the formula. That big jump there a few years ago was the $1 billion that was infused into the program to kind of do the transition from BEP to TISA. Okay, so moving on. The next key takeaway, I'm looking at time here. If Sycamore staff ever just wants to unmute themselves and tell me when I am running out of time, I'm going as fast as I can. And I've got so many screens open that I can't, if y'all are slacking me or anything like that, I can't really tell. Okay, great. I'm getting no hand signals or anything like that. Okay, so the next key takeaway is the budget proposes expanding lottery funded scholarships for TCAT students. So these are students at Tennessee's Colleges of Applied Technologies. So the budget includes 12.1 million total for what are called Tennessee Works scholarships. So these are TCAT scholarships that are expanding beyond the costs that are covered by our Tennessee Promise and Tennessee Reconnect scholarships. So Tennessee Promise and Tennessee Reconnect scholarships are what are called last dollar tuition scholarships. So once every other type of financial aid covers what can be covered, the Tennessee Promise and Reconnect scholarships will step in. This proposed scholarship would actually cover other costs that those won't cover, including things like the tools that you have to buy or required materials. And this would come at a cost of $12.1 million, an estimated cost at $12.1 million. This would come from the Lottery for Education account. I say this because this is being proposed at a time when there are actually quite a few moving parts around both the lottery and the lottery funded scholarships. And I'm going to kind of break this down piece by piece. So looking back to 2019, this is the year before the pandemic through 2024, the last fiscal year. So here is what lottery proceeds have looked like during that time. So pretty volatile and overall not very positive, right? And this is not adjusted for inflation. This is just what it looked like. What also happened during this time is sports betting was legalized, came online in 2020, and beginning in 2021, 80% of a state privilege tax on sports betting began supplementing these lottery dollars to help pay for lottery funded scholarships like the Hope Scholarship and Tennessee Promise. And you see that while they're quite a bit smaller, they did grow pretty fast during this time. It's also believed that sports betting drew customers away from the lottery. So in other words, the lottery and sports betting share the same customer base. They're competing. So here's what scholarship costs also looked like during that time. So in the midst of this, scholarship costs dipped, probably because of the effects of the pandemic, right? College going rates declined during the pandemic, but then they increased rapidly. Why? Well, both Hope scholarships and dual enrollment grants increased in 2022. And then, like I said earlier, the special session diverted sports betting proceeds moving forward unless there is a shortfall. So if there is a shortfall between net lottery proceeds and lottery funded scholarships, the sports betting proceeds, they will go ahead and supplement the net lottery proceeds. Okay, so what happens moving forward? This is what is projected to happen in the fiscal year 2026 budget. Beginning this fiscal year, lottery proceeds alone, the darker maroon line there, they are not expected to be enough to cover scholarship costs. And this does not include the proposed scholarship expansion that's in the budget. So more than likely, the sports betting taxes may be needed to supplement the lottery funds. And so, that does leave implications for that new school construction fund that I talked about earlier. It means that there may not be as much money going into that school construction fund as maybe there was promised, or the impression that was left there. So, just a couple things to think about, both on the scholarship front, the lottery front, and on that school construction front, to keep in mind during this session and as those policies move forward. The next key takeaway is the highway fund structural issues continue to become general fund issues. So the highway fund has dedicated funding sources, but they're just not doing the job. So for one, they just don't keep up with inflation, and the cost of building roads is increasing at a rapid rate, while cars are just getting more fuel efficient. So some background. In 2017, under Governor Haslam, the legislature passed the Improve Act. It increased most of the highway fund taxes, which are considered, sort of user fees. They're the gas taxes, they're fuel taxes. It also instituted new electric vehicle fees. Those kind of failed to keep up with inflation. They're excise taxes, right? They are a price per gallon. No matter how much gas costs at a time, no matter how much it costs to build a road, they stay at that price per gallon. Same with the electric vehicle fees. They stay at that cost per registration. Then we passed the 2023 Transportation Modernization Act. It increased the electric vehicle fees. It instituted a new hybrid vehicle fee. It also introduced, choice lanes, which is another way to pay for roads, and new contracting and delivery models. It was also paired with a $3.3 billion general fund subsidy. Even so, TDOT continues to face a backlog of projects that is just not meeting the demand for road construction in the state of Tennessee. And this is what it looks like. The value of Tennessee's highway fund revenues has plummeted in recent years as road construction costs have ballooned. So the pink bars at the bottom, what they show you is unadjusted, real highway fund revenue collection. So you see kind of that bump up after fiscal year 2017, after the Improve Act went into place. Those fees and gas taxes kind of were phased in over time. So that's why you see it kind of go up, a stair step up. But then you see what those look like after you adjust those for inflation. And those are adjusted specifically for highway construction inflation using the National Highway Construction Cost Index. And you see that just in a few years' time, between fiscal year 2021 and 2024, the value of those dollars declined by 33%. So those revenues are just not doing the job. And this is not a Tennessee problem. This is a national problem. It's a problem for the National Highway Fund, and it is a problem for every state's highway fund right now. Just as these costs are out of control, and as these, existing user fees that states have always relied on are just not doing the job anymore. So what you see is in the 2026 budget, you once again see the governor is asking for another general fund subsidy. This time it is a $1 billion subsidy, a non-recurring one. And then there is a legislative proposal to divert the sales tax on tires. So in a way, sort of another user fee of sort, from the general fund to the highway fund, which amounts to about $80 million a year. So not a huge diversion, but a small way to chip away at that. Okay. Next takeaway is the budget includes dollars for hot issues like childcare and housing. First on housing, there is a starter home revolving fund. This would be about $60 million non-recurring to the Tennessee Housing Development Agency that is intended to increase the availability of affordable starter homes across the state with a focus on rural areas. The other is affordable housing tax credits, about 30 million recurring in revenue reduction to provide tax credits for affordable housing projects, and about half of those tax credits would have to go to projects located in rural areas. On the childcare side, if you sort of think of the childcare issue that we're facing in the state as sort of a three-sided issue of the supply of childcare, the affordability issue, and then the workforce issue, it kind of hits it from all three sides. On the supply side, you see 15 million in non-recurring for the third year of a 3-year investment to establish new or improve existing childcare centers. On the affordability side, there's a $5.9 million recurring investment to expand eligibility for assistance to parents up to 100% of the state median income for parents pursuing a post-secondary degree. And then on the workforce side, $7.2 million for a program that provides supplements to childcare workers to improve their salaries and improve retention. And that one was actually a recommendation in a childcare task force report a few years back. Another takeaway is the budget continues to allocate federal TennCare shared savings dollars for multi-year activities. These dollars are something that the state is receiving under an agreement with the federal government in its Medicaid program. These are kind of a unique thing. You can, if you go to our budget summary, in the section where we talk about this, there is a link to some work that we did on this a few years ago. These dollars are sort of their own animal. They're also among a set of kind of unique funding sources, including like opioid settlement dollars, a K-12 mental health trust fund, that are all going towards kind of health-related activities that are new over the last several years. But here's what those dollars have looked like over the last few years. 2 years ago, it was $331 million total. We're treating these as non-recurring dollars because they are. They're not guaranteed to get them year after year. And the way that they're being applied is, we get them in 1 year and we're applying them to projects that are non-recurring over a span of several years. So 2 years ago, we applied $331 million for some things happening over the course of 8 years. Last year's was $318 million for some rural and behavioral health activities over 6 years. In this budget, it's $256 million for some long-term services and support activities over the course of 6 years. And then I'll point out that $100 million of those shared savings dollars have actually already kind of gone out as loans to local governments mostly in East Tennessee for disaster recovery efforts. I think all that stuff was in the news, so those dollars are likely to come back to the state. And then, they may be committed later. Okay, I think this is my second to last bullet, so I'm almost done. And I think, did we record this? I think we recorded this. So if you want to play it back at like half speed, you might get it better the second time. I'm so sorry, I'm moving fast. Second to last point is the budget doesn't reflect any significant new federal funding cuts in fiscal years 2025 or 2026. And I will say that's not necessarily a surprise. The budget often does not make assumptions about policy decisions that will be made at the federal level if those decisions, have not been made already. But as we know, there is a lot of discussion going on at the federal level about significant new spending cuts. I believe the House at the federal level approved their budget resolution last night that assumes a lot of federal spending cuts. So what you see here is federal funding in Tennessee's budget over time. You see elevated dollars over the last several years coming from COVID-related federal relief efforts. You see a big bump up there in 2025. What you're seeing there is that a lot of those COVID-related dollars States had to obligate them by the end of calendar year 2024. States do have until the end of calendar year 2026 to actually spend those dollars. So that bump is likely to kind of smooth itself out when we go back and see actual expenditures. But what you don't see is any assumptions about big cuts to existing federal dollars, despite those conversations that are going on in DC. So, you know, we don't know, they don't know, but it may or may not happen. Having said that is, there are a lot of agencies that are pretty dependent on federal dollars. You can ignore the title here. This is from a webinar I did yesterday that was focused more on education. But this slide shows you, you know, the top 10 most dependent agencies from just a dollar standpoint in the budget summary. We also have the top 10 from kind of a percentage standpoint as well. And then the last takeaway is the budget continues to stock money away for a rainy day with a $36 million deposit to the rainy day fund in 2026. So what you see here is the balance of our reserve for revenue fluctuations, which is the state's official rainy day fund. Under the budget proposal, it would reach $2.2 billion in the fiscal year 2026 recommended budget, which would be the highest, you know, balance ever. It is a you know, a reserve of last resort by statute in law. That is how it is written. And then you see we kind of always translate that to a days of general fund operations. And you see that puts us, the state again, in a better position than it was going into the Great Recession back in 2007, 2008. So what's next? The last step of the legislative process, of course, is always the governor will tweak the budget at the end with an administration amendment that, you know, will represent compromises that were made with the legislature. You know, sometimes it reflects new information that wasn't known when the budget came out. And then the legislature will make its own amendments, take some of the things away that the governor proposed, add its own stuff. And then the legislature will go home. And it's typically the last thing that the legislature does. And then, of course, again, we plug the budget primer so that in case I said words that didn't make any sense to you today, I guarantee you we probably explained them in the budget primer. So at this point, I didn't actually see any questions come in during the chat during this time unless I missed them. And let's see. Oh, we have 9 whole minutes left for question and answer and also to plug our annual forum. So I'll leave that up on the screen before I stop sharing.
Thanks, Mandy. If anybody does have any questions, you know, now's the time. Maybe like raise your hand and, you know, or if you're feeling bold, you can go ahead and just unmute and ask it.
I'm feeling bold.
All right, Leah, go for it.
Hey, everyone. I'm confirming that 30 million was low-income housing tax credits for the creation of affordable housing, or is there some other magic pot of money in Tennessee to create affordable housing?
So this is a bill that they actually passed last session, and I'm not like deeply familiar with it, to be honest. And the way it was structured is that like they have to pass another resolution to like actually authorize it and have it go into place, but it is a state specific tax credit.
Do you know if they marry it with low-income housing tax credit projects? Is that how it rolls out?
I'm not sure, but if you were to go into the budget summary, where I discuss it, there's like a reference, and that reference will link to the actual public chapter.
Okay.
Oh, and also if you email me, I could just send you the link.
That sounds beautiful. Thank you,
Or maybe
Mandy.
I could find it right now and put it in the chat.
All right. Thanks, Mandy. I appreciate it. That's helpful.
So we've got a few more questions. I think I saw Robert raise his hand first.
Yes, I'm Robert Slavin, a reporter with a bond buyer based in New York. I noticed in the primer you mentioned that this year there was some statewide bonding anticipated for the first time in a while. I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So, and I guess I should also probably qualify that expert generalists don't always know like the deep details of everything. But for the most part, we have not consistently used bonding authority for about the last decade. We have done it a couple of times in the last decade for a couple of projects, as I understand it. But we are now proposing to do that, to start doing that again with some capital projects.
Do you anticipate that this will continue on beyond this coming fiscal year 26?
I mean, my guess is that, as I kind of highlighted in where the money comes from, that the reason that we haven't been doing it is we've had these very large sources of non-recurring revenues in recent years, and this practice of using recurring revenues for non-recurring purposes for fear that we weren't going to have, that they weren't going to materialize as recurring. And what they've chosen to do is dedicate all these things to capital projects. So they really haven't needed to use the bonding authority. And so I think moving forward, those sources of non-recurring revenue that they've been dedicating to those things really won't be there in the same way moving forward. So I do think it is a practice that they'll probably rely on more so moving forward than we really have been in the last few years.
All right.
If the legislature is comfortable with it.
Okay, well, thank you.
William, I think I saw your hand next.
Yes, I'm just reacting, so I'm not sure I'm going to frame this as well as I would prefer. Given that the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy ranks Tennessee as either second or third most regressive in state and local taxes among the 50 states, I'm wondering if Sycamore has done or has thought about doing an analysis of how this budget relates to the various contributions, the tax rates for the household income quintiles, and then how this budget relates to the needs and services required for each of those household income quintiles in Tennessee, given the remarkable regressive state of our state taxes, character of our state taxes. Did I frame that all right?
Yeah, you did. I don't think we have the capability, to be honest, of doing that kind of analysis. I'm very familiar with that work, and actually I think we republished that analysis in our budget primer in discussing sort of the concept of tax structures and what those things look like. Yeah, I just think that's kind of beyond our ability and capacity, given the size of our staff.
This is a chance for you to request more contributions so you can afford it.
You heard it here first, everybody.
Yeah, and you can blame me. You can blame me.
We had a few questions that came in the chat next, I believe. Mandy, do you just want to look through them?
Sorry. So let's see. Sorry. So I'm seeing some research dollars go through the state and others go direct. So okay, so there's some questions about what was approved last night. So what was approved last night is a budget resolution, which is not the budget per se. A budget resolution creates a framework in which Congress kind of, one side of Congress, I will say, it's like that's just the House's budget resolution, is basically saying to itself, these are the parameters we are giving to ourselves for passing appropriations bills and budget. So it's actually not binding. And it is really sort of top line numbers. And we don't actually know yet how that's going to translate into like what it means for Medicaid, what it means for specific departments and things like that. So we are still definitely in a TBD kind of situation when it comes to like what is going to happen with the federal budget. So it is really hard to translate still what is going on at the federal level to real world impacts to state budgets and institutions at the state level and things like that. And if anyone is like more familiar with the federal, I worked in a federal budget office for a while. So, but it's also been a long time ago. So like, I'm rusty if anyone wants to correct me on that.
Got time, like a minute for one last one. Courtney, you have your hand up.
Yes, question. Okay, so you were mentioning how the average pay has not kept up with inflation for teachers. Do we know why that is?
Well, I was doing a little back of the envelope thing kind of a couple days ago when just looking at the 2000, I kind of popped that thing up of, for context, the $2,000 bonus. The fiscal note on that was $198 million, and looking at, a $55,000 salary, $2,000, translates to, I think it was about 3%. And if we're only dedicating 125 million, I mean, there's a few things going on. One, under the BEP, even when the state said, we're giving you 125 million, under the BEP, there was no obligation that locals had to put the 125 million actually towards teacher pay. Also, the BEP did not necessarily cover all teachers just because of the way the BEP works. So that was one problem. Now under TISA, those dollars do actually have to go to teacher pay increases. So there's a couple different things going on. And now that we see those numbers, it is like, is 125 million enough to even keep up with inflation, especially at the rates of inflation that we've been experiencing over the last few years? So I think there's a few things going on there.
Okay, thank you.
And you're also not really getting to see the numbers until a few years out. So you don't really know how well you're doing with those investments in real.
Thank you.
Before we close out, I just wanted to real quickly, one, thank you guys for being with us. Two, you saw that very last slide that Mandy put up was sort of a teaser for Sycamore's annual forum. That's going to be on May 8th. It's a luncheon here in Nashville. And it's an event to support the Sycamore Institute to help raise money for us to keep the lights on and keep doing all this great stuff that we hope that you guys value so much. We would love to see each of you there. You will probably be getting an email in the near future with ticket sales opening up. But for now, if you're interested, go ahead and save the date. The program is going to be, I think, a really timely and relevant one, focused on how do we all live and thrive together in a world where we profoundly disagree. So we look forward to seeing you guys, hopefully there, and certainly again at another